My name is Geert, difficult to pronounce. I'm from the Belgian section and actively involved in the party since the early 90s, since the anti-racism movement of the early 90s. I will mainly deal about Italy, and Christoph from Austria will more talk about Germany. Germany, Austria, you know why. But I think it's an important discussion, because today sometimes comparisons are again made between the storming of the Capitol in the US and, for example, the march on Rome by Mussolini and the Italian fascists in the 1920s. Now, this comparison does not really hold water. It's not a correct way to make a comparison. The attack on the Capitol is more comparable to the first provocations of the French fascists in 1934, when they, with a few thousands, with 10, 20,000, tried to storm the French parliament, then with a march for power supported by big business in Italy in 1922. Now, the March on Rome by Mussolini and the fascists in October 22 was the culmination, was the high point of a period of intense class struggle, a period in which the working class had the potential to seize power, supported by a mass movement on the countryside, and they could have been able to do this. That's also what Mussolini later on said. He said that the labor movement, in fact, had missed a unique revolutionary situation at that period. And there was a revolutionary potential in the early 20s in Italy because of different reasons, different elements of anger that were present in society, but also feelings of that things had to become better after the war. The war took a heavy toll on the population, a population that already had a lot of problems before the First World War, with a lot of people who had to emigrate in Northern Europe or towards the United States because of the misery in Italy itself. After the war, it didn't become better for the majority of the people. And this, of course, had an impact on consciousness. The first reactions came from the workers' movement with the strike movement in 1919, a strike movement that was part of a movement that took place everywhere in Europe at that time. After the First World War, the German Revolution, the Russian Revolution, of course. In Italy as well, there were mass strikes, a mass movement of the working class, demanding a better future, demanding, in fact, control on society. They didn't really know how to do it. There were elements of protesters looting shops to sell the confiscated goods at a cheaper price as a protest against price rises and that sort of elements. But it showed the potential. It showed the potential, this strike movement, especially if it would have been organized, if the trade union leadership and the Socialist Party leadership would have taken the movement in hand, it would have developed a lot further. But the trade union leadership and the social democratic leadership, they were surprised, and they mainly called to keep everything calm, to remain within the negotiations and remain within the framework of what was acceptable, not acceptable for the majority of the people, but acceptable for the establishment. That's how the movement started in 1919. At the same time, there was big land occupations by farm workers and small farmers on the countryside, mainly soldiers who returned to their villages and hoped that they would return to a better life. where they could actually own their own land, but which wasn't the case, and this led to these massive land occupations. So there's different elements coming together in 1919, and in 1920 this struggle is even continuing with massive factory occupations, mainly in the metal sector at that time, but incredible scenes of tens of thousands of workers occupying their own factories, having general assemblies to decide on running the factory, on controlling the factory, putting up dormitories and kitchens in the factories, but also red guards to defend the factories against the police, the army, but also against the militias, the right-wing militias that existed and that were armed, because with a lot of ex-soldiers returning home, of course, there was some experience amongst broader layers of the population of having more physical ways to demonstrate their political positions. So there was a huge potential with this factory occupation movement, but the trade union leadership wanted to limit this movement to only the metal sector, didn't want it to spread to different sectors. And at the same time, the Socialist Party, which was a broad party with in it both a left wing and a right wing, the left wing was very late to split from the right wing, had some illusions in the right wing that it could convince the right wing to become left wing. But the Socialist Party, in the end, it was the right wing that decided the real policies of this party. And on a local level, the left wing that would become the Communist Party later on, only in 21, which is very late, this left wing on a local level supported the strike and called for an escalation of the occupations and of the strikes. But on a national level, it was the right wing that controlled the party, and that made that there was no national appeal from the party to escalate, to coordinate the movement. On the contrary, in the end, the trade union leadership, who was confronted with a potential revolutionary development, signed an agreement of a limited wage increase, which in itself was positive. But what was at stake was a lot more than just a bit more wage for the workers who were involved in that movement. So it is correct, and it doesn't happen a lot that we can say that Mussolini was correct, but Mussolini was correct when he said that that there was a unique revolutionary situation and that the labor movement did not take advantage of this situation in 1919, 1920. If the labor movement doesn't take advantage of a revolutionary situation, other forces will do. Other forces will try to gain ground to put an end to that revolutionary situation. And that is exactly what the role of the fascists was in Italy. Mussolini's fascists grew very quickly in that period. They were still a very small force in 1919 to become a mass force with hundreds of thousands of members by 1922. So they grew very quickly, and they could only do this because there was support behind them. The Italian bosses, they organized themselves to stop the revolutionary situation, to stop the workers moving into action, and used Mussolini's fascists because they had the power, they had a force that was able to physically go against the workers' movement. They had a lot of war veterans, and they had the potential to stop this. But of course, that was not enough. That was not enough to stop the workers' movement. It also was because of the demoralization of a part of the workers' movement, disillusionment after the failure to go through with the factory occupations, with the strike movement, and so on, which led to some impasse, a situation where the workers' movement didn't see a way forward. And this, of course, also helped the fascists to gain confidence. If the workers' movement is showing confidence, is going forward, it's more difficult for counter-revolutionary forces to do so, because they will immediately have to fight that confidence of the revolutionary movement. That is an element. The other element, of course, is that the bosses, they put a lot of money in the fascist movement because they were very afraid of this revolutionary situation. They saw the potential, and they even saw the potential sometimes clearer than how the workers' movement saw that potential. At least the leadership of the workers' movement didn't see the potential as clear as the bosses did. And that's an element Trotsky warns about in Wither France, which is an excellent book to read. He warns in that book that, of course, organization against the fascist threat is necessary, but that the more the working class is organizing, the stronger the reaction will be trying to strike back, and the more support the bosses will give to the shock troops against the potential power of the workers' movement. That is, of course, not a call not to organize, but it is to assess the dynamics of the buildup of a relation of forces, of a balance of forces, which is not a straightforward process, and that we need to take into account. The fascists were able to go forward. They tested out with provocations, like an attack on the town hall of Bologna in November 1920, a violent attack on the town hall of a city that was seen as a red bastion, center of red politics. And they were able to storm the town hall. 10 people got killed in the event, and it was a bit of a test. There was not a lot of reaction from the workers' movement, so the fascists grew more confident to go steps further than that. That's also a lesson that should be learned, that is that weakness leads to aggression. If an attack of counter-revolution sees that the reaction against it is very weak, then that will lead to more aggression from the counter-revolutionary forces. There was a problem with the policies of the left to reply to this. The Socialist Party and the Communists, they had illusions in the bourgeoisie to stop the fascists. They said that legal measures had to be taken, that their own troops should not go into battle, should not reply to provocations. They even handed in the weapons they still had in their hands, and the weapons they didn't hand in, the police was very quickly to seize those weapons from the workers' movement. So in fact, they gave away the possibilities to reply. Not that it should have been done purely with weapons, of course, but they also gave in on the issue of organizing themselves instead of relying on the bourgeoisie and relying on the capitalist state to take action. The workers' movement had to take action themselves in order to be able to stop the fascists from coming to power, from organizing the March on Rome, and from being part of a coalition government from 1922 on. In Italy, the fascists came very soon on, in a situation that they were part of the government. At the moment when their own party was still quite unstable, you have to think about it, a party that 3 years before only had a few thousand members, suddenly becomes a party that is in power, that can almost do whatever they want to do. You can imagine the sort of unstable organization this still was. They didn't had the whole period of preparation that, for example, the German Nazis had before they came to power more than 10 years later. That also explains why in Italy, the fascists, when they were taken in a coalition government, in the beginning, they could not implement all the typical features of a fascist dictatorship. They still had to accept that the workers' movement was organized, that trade unions existed, that Communist Party, Socialist Party were represented in parliament and were organized. That sort of elements, they couldn't stop immediately. But of course, a party that is in power can use its power to take steps towards this, more classic element of fascist dictatorship. And that's what they did. By 1926, the trade unions were banned, Socialist Party were banned, Communist Party was banned, and at the same time, when some discontent started to develop within the fascist trade unions, you cannot really call that trade unions if it's organized by the fascists, because it's not aimed at organizing the working class against the bosses. But even then, the fascists had set up trade unions to try to win workers to their side and to be organized by the fascists. But even there, some discontent developed, given the antisocial, anti-worker measures taken by the government. When that happened, the Federation of Fascist Unions was also banned. And there you can see the fact that there was an element of instability within the fascist organization as well, but that by 1926-27, the fascist party had become enough bureaucratized, enough centralized by small bureaucracy to change the character of its own party as well, and to take measures against their own forces. In fact, the fascists were able to defeat the retreating working class by using forces of what we would call the petty bourgeoisie, elements of people not really linked to the workers' movement, small independents, farmers, people not really part of the workers' movement. They used that dynamic to the dynamic of the petty bourgeoisie to come to power and to become a mass force. To become a mass force, the fascists needed an anti-capitalist rhetoric, but to get the support of big business, it was necessary for the fascists to divert this anti-capitalism into nationalism and racism, using whatever method they could use to do this, making nationalism into something as a almost religious issue with different forms in different countries. In Italy, for example, the campaigns against Jewish people came a lot later because there was fewer Jewish people that lived in Italy. It was not seen as an immediate threat, or it could not be used by the fascists to divert attention and to not talk about how the system works, but rather talk about Jewish capitalists and so on, to have at least that element of anti-capitalism, so-called, but at the same time only defending division. In fact, fascism can be seen as a bit of a desperate act of capitalism, a capitalism that is not able to control the danger of revolution in a different way, and is not able to defend its own position in a different way, and needs shock troops to break the workers' movement. That is the role, the historical role of fascism. And fascism has done what capital demanded. In Italy, for example, in 1927, a 20% wage cut was introduced for 2 million workers. The reply of Mussolini to the crisis after 1929 was to have the nominal wages in Italy halved. Between 27 and 32, nominal wages were halved, which is incredible how much the working class lost by this. I mean, it was an attack against the workers. Fascism delivered for capital in that sense. Of course, in the long run, fascism became a problem for capitalism, but that's a different story. I think we should also clarify that there is no fundamental difference between Italian and German fascism. It's not because in Italy fascism needed a longer period of building up towards that fascist dictatorship compared to Germany, that it was fundamentally different. It was the same process that was happening, big business appealing to the desperate petty bourgeoisie to break up the workers' movement. The same process happened in Italy as it did in Germany, a process that was only possible after demoralization of the workers' movement, after fundamental defeats as well of the labor movement. And why fundamental defeats? Because, well, a small defeat can have a temporarily effect on consciousness of the working class. But if the counter reaction is coming too soon, is doing a premature attempt to have a counter-revolutionary system installed, it can have an opposite role. It can play a bit the role of the whip of counter-revolution, stimulating revolution, which is actually what we have seen, but Christoph will talk about that in Germany with the Kapp putsch in 1920, or even with the in France in 1934, the big fascist provocations with the demonstrations on the 6th of February 1934, that in reality led to huge anti-fascist counter-protests, in which the rank and file of the Socialist Party and the Communist Party came together, pushed their own leadership to accept the idea of unity, which the leadership then abused to install a people's front, which included the bourgeoisie in the unity, but still it was the pressure from below that created unity, that created a movement, and that led in the end to the strike movement of 1936 in France, when French capitalism was under serious threat, when Trotsky wrote at that period, the French Revolution has begun. And I mean, that element of when counter-revolution strikes too soon, that can be a real danger, of course. That's why there have to be fundamental defeats before fascism can develop and can install its dictatorship. Now, a few final remarks. There's important differences, of course, between today and the situation in the 1920s and the 1930s. The main differences is that the extreme right wing today is not as much organized as a mass force. Of course, the workers' movement is less organized, especially politically. On the trade union field, that's not everywhere the case, but anyway, the extreme right is not that much organized as a mass force. Just to give one idea, in the US, the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s had up to 4 million members. That's a hell of a lot. The Nazi Party had a few million members in 1933. I mean, if you compare that with the biggest far-right organizations today, and I think worldwide the really biggest one will be the RSS, the Hindu nationalist militias in India, which organize a bit more than 4 million people, which is about as much as the KKK in the US, the 1920s, but with that difference that I think there's slightly more people living in India today compared to the US 100 years ago. So I mean, that relative, that's a difference as well. That's one element. Of course, an important reason for this is that the role, the impact of the petty bourgeoisie in society as a whole is more limited. A whole part of the petty bourgeoisie has been competed away under capitalism, or has become integrated in the working class, leaving less room for the petty bourgeoisie, or being a less important force. That's an element as well. I think another element, and that's perhaps the most crucial one, is that at this moment we're not in a period of fundamental defeats of the workers' movement, but rather in the beginning of an upward phase of the workers' movement, of workers' struggle, starting to become, coming back to the fore after a defensive period of a neoliberal offensive following the fall of Stalinism at the end of the 1980s. So that's a different period as well, where we are in at the present time. That is not to say that the extreme right is not dangerous today. It is not able to establish a fascist dictatorship, but it is able to strengthen itself, to strengthen elements of division, and in that sense, strengthening elements that are obstacles for a successful revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. And if we don't fight obstacles in our way, then the obstacles will become bigger. That's a reason as well why the fight against all things that divide us, like racism, sexism, and so on, is so important. And of course, we also need to take into account that a period of polarization is never one-sided. The polarization comes at different sides of the class divide, of the political divide. The far right will be able to gain ground in the present period. The workers' movement is able to stop this. We also saw this with the movement against Golden Dawn in Greece, which is a very important example for anti-fascists today. So, I mean, we need to take that into account as well. But anyway, a last sentence. It's always nice to stop with Trotsky, and he has written a lot on fascism, very important material. But Trotsky always explained that fascism is an expression of counter-revolutionary despair that can only take power when the revolutionary hope of the working class has failed to materialize. That also explains the task that we have. We have to make sure that the revolutionary hope for a better society can win the consciousness of the masses, and that is the best way to be able to stop all elements of the far right. It was like that in the 1920s, 1930s, and it still is today. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Geert already made a lot of very good points on Italy, and I want to focus more on the rise to power of German fascism, and what lessons we can draw for that for today. And I think it's important to study the history of fascism, especially because I think a wrong analysis of fascism and flowing from the wrong strategies are also very common in the broader left today. So it was exactly today in 1933 that Hitler was handed over power by the center parties, and by that started the final defeat of the working class. And I think the victory of fascism in Germany is a special tragedy, of course, because of the incredible cruelty of German fascism that killed millions, but also because the strongest and most organized labor movement in the world, where the SPD and the KPD organized millions between them, was defeated without a real fight. I think, as Geert already made a couple of very good points on the social situation, that's the rise of fascism, the defeats of the working class, and so on. And in Germany, you could see a very similar situation after the end of the First World War. There was a revolutionary wave sweeping across the whole Germany. Revolutionary councils Soviets were established in most of the bigger German cities, and the power for the working class was basically within their reach. But Social Democrats, the Social Democratic leadership stepped in to prevent the revolutionary development and directed into parliamentary democracy. They often did this by organizing brutal massacres and attacks against revolutionary workers in a number of cities, by killing, for example, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. There will be a workshop on Rosa Luxemburg tomorrow. And they did this often by using the same far-right parliamentary groups that would later become an important base of fascism. Throughout its existence, the so-called Weimar Republic was dominated by high-class tensions, and in the end, nobody really wanted this republic. The working class and the majority of the working class wanted a socialist alternative, and the old ruling class hated democracy and the achievements of the revolution of 1918. So in the period of 1918 to 1923, there were numerous revolutionary situations in Germany where the working class could have taken power if it was not for the betrayal of social democracy and mistakes of the young and immature Communist Party. I want to go into two specific incidents. One Geert already raised, and it's the coup putsch of March 1920. Right-wing generals tried to overthrow the parliamentary democracy and crush the workers' movement. So they dissolved the Social Democratic government, and after the Social Democrats realized that the state apparatus won't save them, they called on the working class and on workers to resist. And within 5 days, and a general strike that involved millions of workers, this uprising was crushed. You can see in this picture that the militias that were involved in this coup already carried the swastika of Nazi fascism, the helmets. But the working class resistance did not stop at defeating fascism, but went further. There were far-reaching demands of the trade unions, of the social democratic led trade unions, that demand nationalization and so on. And the ruling class had to agree to a whole lot of far-reaching demands. Some of them were withdrawn later, but nevertheless. And in some parts of the countries, the offensive of the workers went even further. In the Ruhr area, the Red Ruhr Army was formed with 80,000 soldiers under arms. And again, this uprising was only crushed by the SPD government using some of the same parliamentary groups. And this, as Geert already indicated, this coup showed similar to, for example, also the Kornilov coup in Russia, or the events in France, 1934, how an attempt to coup, or how an attempt to overthrow democracy and the working class organizations can backfire on the ruling class. This was also the climate in which Hitler and the Nazis were formed in Munich at the beginning of the 20s. From the start on, Hitler was financed by the Bavarian Ministry of the Reichswehr, you could say Defense Ministry, Bavarian Defense Ministry. And at that time, Munich was a stronghold of far-right forces, especially after the Munich Soviet Republic was crushed by parliamentary groups in 1919. And in 1923, Hitler, inspired by the events in Rome, by the March of Rome, tried to organize his first coup, the so-called beer hall coup, and this attempt failed miserably. It was dispersed by police and by the army within a very short time, and it quite clearly showed that the ruling class at that time wasn't in any way ready to put their trust into a fascist experiment, because they could not trust that they would be strong enough to lead to victory, and also because the SPD and bourgeois democracy were at that time still more useful for them to keep power. But after this coup, the Nazis basically stayed on, even if Hitler and the supporters only got very short prison sentences, they stayed a very insignificant force until the economic crisis in 1929. See at this picture. The economic crisis hit Germany very hard. It was after the US, probably one of the hardest hit country in the world. Unemployment rose from 1 million in 1927 to more than 6 million in 1930. The GDP was reduced, and the whole layer of small business owners and the middle layers were ruined. You can see also in this picture that the real rise of Nazi membership, for example, and it would be even more drastic with the votes for the Nazis, took place after the economic crisis in 1929. Yes, Geert already said the majority support of the Nazis always came from the middle layers, from small business owners, from also from former soldiers and so on. And I think sometimes today there is still this myth of the Nazis being a workers' party because of their name, National Socialist German Workers' Party. But in the end, the facts show that this is completely untrue. the share of working class parties, so the SPD and the KPD, stayed basically the same throughout the whole rise of the Nazis. And even after the Nazis took power in 1933, they only reached 3% in workplace elections, in elections to workplace councils. So I think Trotsky puts a lot of emphasis on explaining how fascism is this movement of the impoverished middle layers and the petty bourgeoisie. And I think it's important today to understand this dynamics, to understand fascism. Yeah, as said, the middle layers were hit almost as hard as the working class by the crisis of 1929, but they had no real organization that would fight for them. The working class could at least turn to the trade unions, the Social Democrats, and so on. But the middle layers were basically disappointed with all political parties. Trotsky writes about this in What is National Socialism? The post-war chaos hit the artisans, the peddlers, and the civil employees no less cruelly than the workers. The economic crisis in agriculture was ruining the peasantry. The decay of the middle strata did not mean that they were made into proletarians, inasmuch as the proletariat itself was casting out a gigantic army of chronically unemployed. The pauperization of the petty bourgeoisie, barely covered by ties and socks of artificial silk, eroded all official creeds, and first of all the doctrine of parliamentary democracy. Yes, with the impoverishing of the middle classes, also the support of the parliamentary democracy was rapidly decreasing. And of course, as Geert really pointed out, it's possible that the working class and that the middle layers can be won to the program of a socialist revolution, but as explained above, the working class missed a whole number of opportunities to take power, and if the working class is not able to show a way forward, then the petty bourgeoisie can turn against them. Again, Trotsky writes about that in The Only Road. But if the Revolutionary Party, in spite of a class struggle becoming increasingly more associated, proves time and again to be incapable of uniting the working class behind it, if it vacillates, becomes confused, contradicts itself, then the petty bourgeoisie loses patience and begins to look upon the revolutionary workers as those responsible for its own misery. And then it goes on, when the social crisis takes on an intolerable acuteness, a particular party appears on the scene with the direct aim of agitating the petty bourgeoisie of white heat and of directing its hatred and its despair against the proletariat. In Germany, this historic function is fulfilled by National Socialism, a broad current whose ideology is composed of all putrid vapors and decomposing bourgeois society. Yeah, I think this is a quite good description of Trotsky, of bourgeois ideology, of the ideology of the Nazis, which basically stayed, the program and the ideology stayed quite vague and tried to express exactly this fear of the middle layers of losing their position. Trotsky once wrote, not every petty bourgeois could become a Hitler, but a particle of Hitler is lodged in every expatriated petty bourgeois. And this is, Geert already touched on it, this is expressed in the anti-Semitism and the superficial anti-capitalism of the Nazis, where they always agitated against big capital, and gathering capital, but at the same time didn't touch private property, because deep down the middle layers still hope to be a successful businessman themselves. And anti-Semitism proved very useful for the Nazis, because they could give the guilt for all evils that happened to the middle layers, to the Jewish population, and to the Jewish conspiracy that allegedly united big capital and Bolshevism. And I think if we look at far-right movements today, they have a very similar social base. If we look at the people who stormed the Capitol in Washington, then you see a lot of former soldiers, a lot of small business owners, and so on. And also, if you look at far-right movements like Pegida in Germany, it's not mainly workers who are the base of this movement, but middle layers, people who have something to lose, and so on. And I think the danger, Geert already said a couple of points why the middle layers, or why the fascist threat is smaller today from the middle layers. But I think a big danger is because the lack of a working class voice and the confusion in working class consciousness is that it's easier for those far-right forces to gather a significant amount of support from the working class. So for example, we have a lot of the far-right populist parties in Europe have a very strong voting base amongst working people. And I think we need to be aware that the Corona crisis had an especially crushing effect on those middle layers, on small business owners, and so on, even more than a, would say, normal capitalist crisis. And I think we can see this in the growing Corona demonstrations and so on, that this threat is from the right is real. But at the same time, I think it's very correct of how Geert, the limitations that Geert explained, that the petty bourgeoisie is far smaller than in the 30s, but also that some layers who were important parts of the middle layers in the 30s are now parts of the working class, or sometimes even amongst the most competitive parts of the working class, so civil servants, teachers, and so on. As Geert already touched on, in the end, the transfer of power to Hitler was only possible because the ruling class handed it over to them. Because the ruling class was convinced that they needed to get rid of democracy. Trotsky describes the relationship of the ruling class and capitalism with parliamentary democracy, and the only way in this quote. But precisely with the war, there begins a distinct decline of capitalism, and above all of its democratic form of domination. It's now no longer a matter of new reform at arms, but of cutting down and abolishing the old ones. Therewith, the bourgeoisie comes into conflict not only with the institutions of proletarian democracy, trade unions, and political parties, but also with parliamentary democracy, within the framework of which the workers' organizations rose. Hence, the campaign against Marxism on the one hand, and against democratic parliamentarism on the other hand. So the economic crisis of 1929 made it more urgent for the ruling class to get rid of the achievements of the revolution in 1918. The SPD wasn't the best tool to do this anymore, because on the one hand, they weren't fast enough. You couldn't cut those achievements fast enough with the SPD. But on the other hand, because of course the SPD lost support with every austerity policy they introduced, and the KPD would grow. So from 1930 onwards, the ruling class would would increasingly put their trust on Hitler, with more money flowing into from big business flowing into the Nazi party. For example, or also political support. In November 1932, leading industrial figures wrote a letter to the president, Hindenburg, demanding to make Hitler chancellor. There is this, maybe some of you know this picture of a working class newspaper that says the use of the Hitler greeting, and below that small, behind Hitler there are millions, and by that referring to the millions that Hitler received from big business. And because some parts of the ruling class were still afraid because of the anti-capitalist rhetoric of the Nazis increasingly focused on explaining at meetings of industrialists and so on that they wouldn't fundamentally touch their interests. I found this quote of the former conservative chancellor of Germany, Brüning, who wrote to Churchill in 1937. Hitler's real rise began only in 1929, when German big industrialists and others refused to continue to distribute funds to a lot of patriotic organizations, which until then had done all the work of German risorgimento. In their view, these organizations were too progressive in their social thoughts. They were glad that Hitler wanted to radically disfranchise the workers. The monetary donations they were felt from other organizations flowed to Hitler's organizations. This, of course, is the usual beginning of fascism. And this is said by not a socialist, but as I said, a conservative politicians. And fascism proved very profitable for German capital, as it did for Italian capital. The share of the capitalist in national income increased from 17.4% to 26.6%. And the wage of a skilled worker was reduced from 101 penny in 1929 to 79 pennies in 1939. So I won't go into the into the exact dynamics of the last Bonapartist government in Germany that preceded Hitler. But to summarize, you could say that the president Hindenburg handed over power to more and more Bonapartistic and authoritarian governments. And the SPD, unto a long time, supported this and put all the trust and hope in the fight against fascism in the constitution of the Weimar Republic. In 1932, they even supported this conservative candidate for presidency, Paul von Hindenburg, in the elections, who in the end, only 1 year later, would hand over the power to Hitler. And at that time, like the ruling class, they wouldn't agree on how they want to get rid of democracy, if they want to use Hitler or how to use Hitler, but they would agree that they would end democracy, and in the end handed over the power to Hitler, as I said, on the 30s, like today in 1933. And within a short period, much quicker than in Italy, the fascists consolidated power. The first banned the KPD. On the 2nd of May, they banned the trade unions, and on the 22nd of June, they banned the SPD and made the victory of fascism complete. So the last part of my lead-off, I want to focus on the mistakes of the workers' movement that led to the victory of fascism. I think it's very important to be aware of the balance of forces, even in briefly before the fascists took power. The Nazis had around 850,000 members in 1932. The SA had 430,000 members, whereas the communists had a membership of 300,000, and the SA was basically the armed part of the Nazis. And the communists had, as I said, a membership of 300,000 and 100,000 in armed organizations. The Reichsbanner, one can say the Social Democratic and Republican Defense Organization, had around 3.5 million members. And of course, this direct comparison of forces does not take into account the position of the working class in the economy and the power that this would provide. And this is a crucial part of all of Trotsky's writing in this period, that until the end he does not accept that the victory of fascism is sure and is clear, but points out a strategy how it could be defeated. But I think these figures, this comparison of forces alone, shows that the victory of fascism was not due to any deeper relationship of forces, but because of mistakes of the leadership of the labor movement. The SPD, as I already touched on, they put all their trust not into class struggle or into the mass movement of the working class, but in the structures of the Weimar Republic. They used, and in the bourgeois state, they defended the bourgeois state previously against the workers' movement, and hoped it would defend them now against the Nazis. But still, even if the leadership of the SPD was completely bourgeois, the trade union, the SPD was still a mass working class party, and by that it was clear that the power of fascism would mean the crushing of the SPD and a real threat of the membership. I think this kind of appealing to the state and trying to, and in the face of a fascist threat, getting closer to the establishment is a real danger in the fight against fascism today as well. I think if you look at the first reactions that the Squad or AOC did in the light of the attack on the Capitol, it poses some similarities, even if this attack was far from an attempt to take power, but where they aligned stronger to the establishment Democrats and put their trusts in like measures of the state like impeachment and so on. But of course, we know that the opportunism of the social democratic and trade union leaders knows no limits. And even after the fascists took power, the leaders of social democracy and the social democrats and the trade unions tried to adapt to fascism. The social democrats elected a leadership body without Jewish members because they tried to fit in, like to adapt to the Nazi regime. So the real question is why the KPD was not able to win over the working class support of the SPD to a joint struggle. Of course, a part of this was because of the mistakes the KPD committed in the period between 1918 and 1923, but even more so because of the mistakes they did in the fight against fascism. I think many of you would know that the strategy that the Comintern and the KPD used in the fight against the Nazis was the so-called social fascism theory, that basically explained that the social democrats were just one variant of fascism. Thälmann said in a conference in 1929, well, fascism in Italy and in other countries has reached a dictatorship in its pure form. There is in some countries a particularly dangerous form of fascist development, the form of social fascism. And even if this theory sounds very absurd for us today, I think it also in partly reflected the feeling of some members and voters of the KPD who were not only once victimized by the social democratic police and so on. I think another main mistake of the KPD is that they wrongly estimated the strength and the danger that comes from fascism. The KPD didn't only analyze the social democrats as fascists, but they also saw all the governments preceding Hitler as fascism. So they did not grasp the qualitative change that would be that a Hitler victory would mean for them. And Thälmann is allegedly said, after Hitler, it's our turn. So I think this is part of the reasons why we today we are very careful how we use the word fascism and warn against it being overused and used to describe everything evil, because you lose sight of the decisive impact that a fascist victory can have. And I won't go into that in detail, but the KPD also in times tried to win over the support from the Nazis by using nationalistic rhetoric themselves and so on. And opposed to that, the Trotskyist movement, Trotsky proposed the strategy of a united front. This meant basically that the core ideas of the strategy, out of the tactic was that one needs to be aware that the historic task of fascism is to crush the workers' movement and keep it fragmented. And that a victory of fascism would mean a decisive defeat for the working class and would throw it back for decades. And because of the working class base of the social democracy, they and the social democracy and especially the members are under direct threat from fascism. And of course, to get rid of fascism once and for all, you need to overcome capitalism. And for that, the Communist Party needs to win over social democratic workers. But this can only happen if the social democratic workers and social democracy is first won to a joint struggle against fascism. And to achieve that, he proposed, as I said, a united front. And this is not the KPD at that time proposed a united front from below, which in the end meant that they basically demanded the workers of the SPD to just join their fight and their struggle. And Trotsky argued that the offer for a united front needs to be unconditional and offered to the rank and file of the Social Democratic Party, as well as leadership bodies, to remove all possible barriers for that united front. And if the Social Democrats, the party, would agree to those offers, this would mean a united and decisive force against fascism. And in the process of fighting fascism, the Communist Party could be better positioned to win over social democratic workers. And if they refuse such an unconditional offer, it would make it easier to convince the social democratic worker that they should leave the Social Democratic Party and join the fight, the anti-fascist struggle with the Communist Party. But Trotsky also emphasized I need to finish up quick. But Trotsky also emphasized that a united front needs to be done with complete political independence. He wrote, no common platform with the Social Democrats or with the leaders of the German trade unions, no common publications, banners, placards, march separately, but strike together. Agree only how to strike, whom to strike, and when to strike. Yeah. And I think I want to finish on the point how to translate this lesson for today, or this point for today. I think one needs to be a little bit careful how to translate Trotsky's proposal for a united front to today's situation. In Germany, where Trotsky developed his writings, the main problem was that the working class was highly organized, but because of the division into two parties, they were incapable of having a united fight against fascism. So Trotsky's aim in proposing a united front was to guarantee the broadest possible struggle of the working class. I think today we have hardly any mass parties of the working class, no mass organizations of the working class outside of the unions. And that's why when we talk about a united strategy, how to defeat fascism today, our focus should not be on building an anti-fascist alliance and so on. Of course, we do that. But within that, we focus on how we can mobilize the working class and working class layer to struggle against fascism. This means, for example, appealing to trade unions, mobilizing in neighborhoods, and so on, to get the working class involved. Yeah, I'll finish up because I'm over time already. I think I just want to re-emphasize the points that Geert made at the end of his lead-off. Even though I think it's very important to study the 1930s and the rise of fascism and to draw the lessons from it, I think there will be many chances of the working class to put the mark on events and sideline fascist forces, as well as push back fascist forces directly, as happened in Greece, before a fascist takeover becomes a real possibility.